Well, hello and welcome to In the Growth Space. I'm David McGlennon. Man, I have been waiting for this episode for quite some time. Really excited to bring this episode to you today. You know, In the Growth Space podcast is all about growth, and it's all about growth as leaders, as organizations, as teams. And one of the things that all of those things have is a culture. And so we're going to talk today to a leader, an author, and a thought leader around the idea of culture and leadership. And so I think today will challenge you, will help you maybe even think a little bit differently about culture and really how to build a high performance culture. So we're talking with Mark Miller today. And, you know, Mark is an international best-selling author, and he is a business leader. He's a communicator. And Mark began writing almost 20 years ago when he teamed up with Ken Blanchard, the author of The 1 Minute Manager. And he wrote the book, The Secret, What Great Leaders Know and Do. And his most recent book is called Culture Rules. And we've got a fantastic conversation today around the subject of culture and leadership. And he has over 1 million books in print and in more than 25 languages. He is a global influencer, and his global impact continues to grow. In addition to his writing, Mark enjoys speaking to leaders, and over the years, he's traveled to dozens of countries, teaching for numerous international organizations, and his theme is always the same: encouraging and equipping leaders. So you're going to hear the story, but Mark started his Chick-fil-A career working as an hourly team member in 1977. Then in 1978, he joined the corporate staff working in the warehouse and the mailroom. Since that time, he's provided leadership for corporate communications, field operations, quality and customer satisfaction, training and development, and leadership development. During his tenure with Chick-fil-A, the company has grown from 75 restaurants to over 2,300 locations and an annual sales approaching $10 billion. So he's been on an amazing growth journey himself, not only with Chick-fil-A, but in his leadership journey. Mark lives an active lifestyle. I love that. As a photographer, he enjoys shooting in some of the world's hardest to reach places. And he's been to some locations that are really cool. He's been to Antarctica. He's been to Everest Base Camp, which is really cool, the jungles of Rwanda, and the Galapagos Islands. He's married to his wife, Donna, his high school sweetheart for over 35 years. And he's got 2 sons, Justin and David, and a daughter-in-law, Lindsay, and 3 amazing grandchildren. And so I'm so excited to bring you this conversation with Mark today. So let's get into the episode right now. Well, hey, Mark, welcome to In the Growth Space podcast. Man, I'm super excited that you're here. Been waiting for this conversation for quite a while. I'm really excited.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, you bet. You know, many podcasters always, ask the question at the beginning, hey, tell us about, how you got here. But I want to change things up a little bit. And I would love to just hear what got you into culture? What kind of struck that, or what was that catalyst like for you that really, just brought it up to the forefront for you?
Well, I've got to go back a few years to provide a little context. It was about 25 years ago, we, as an organization, I spent more than 40 years at Chick-fil-A. I worked on the corporate staff. And about 25 years ago, we began to work on identifying and attempting to solve some leadership challenges. In fact, historically, we would try to look 3 to 5 years into the future and say, what are the barriers or obstacles that we can anticipate, and how might we better prepare ourselves and our leaders when those things become reality? Mm-hmm. And we've done 12 projects like that over the last 25 years. And several years ago, we were in that conversation again. And the observation surfaced that more and more leaders were talking about culture. This even pre-COVID, it was
Okay.
coming up more and more
Yeah.
because culture's always been important. And you
Right.
might argue it's become increasingly difficult to create the culture that leaders really want and need for any
Mm.
number of reasons. We can get into that later. Um, but we didn't want to stop there. We began to talk to leaders again, or continue to talk to leaders about those emerging barriers, obstacles, and opportunities. And what we realized is a lot of leaders who weren't even talking about culture directly, if
Uh-huh.
you peel back one or two layers, the issues and challenges they were struggling with were really culture, found their roots in culture.
Got
And
it.
so we just said, we think this is something we'd love to have a point of view on.
Mm.
And thankful that we made that decision. Of course, we knew nothing about the pandemic,
Yeah.
but I think one thing for sure, the pandemic put extreme pressure on organizational culture. And when you
Mm.
put a
Yeah.
culture under pressure, a couple things happen. It certainly showcases strengths. I
Sure.
think you and your listeners, you saw a lot of examples of resilience and grit
Mm.
and creativity
Yes.
and innovation. And that's true. Those kind of
Yeah.
things surface under pressure. But something else that surfaces under pressure are cracks and
Yeah.
gaps and
Mm.
opportunities. And a lot of leaders had been oblivious to those cracks and those
Sure.
gaps until COVID hit. And so, coming out of the pandemic, I have had more leaders than I can count who have specific questions about how to strengthen their culture. And so,
Mm.
thankfully, we began this work several years ago.
Yeah, I love that. And really one of the things that I noticed, and we even talked about off camera before we started rolling here, is that really culture is a leadership issue. And I'd love for you to speak into that for just a moment, because I think there's a lot of leaders who just they talk about culture and they think, oh yeah, culture, okay, I'm gonna assign that task to human resources,
Mhm.
or people development. What do you say to that? And how would you address that?
Well, when we began this work, we said we want to try to figure out what is universally true about the
Mm,
topic. And
yeah.
so, obviously, any number of ways you could have approached that. We chose to talk to leaders and frontline contributors around the world. And we
Mm,
ended up
nice.
interviewing or surveying over 6,000 folks from 10 countries in an
Uh-huh.
attempt to really say, what can we say with confidence about
Mhm.
organizational culture? And to your point, um, over 70% of US leaders, 71 plus or minus percent, and just under that, about 70% of global leaders said that culture is the most powerful tool at their disposal to
Mm.
drive performance.
Yeah,
I
wow.
mean, so leaders, at least at an intuitive or intellectual level, we didn't tell them what, I mean, nothing
Yeah,
scored higher, by the way. I mean, they gave
wow.
us a lot of answers, but 72%, 71% said culture, the most powerful tool at our disposal to drive performance. Now, I've been hanging around leaders my whole career, and I know
Mm,
most leaders care about performance. So
right.
you would think that this would inform their actions.
Mhm.
Well, the next question was the one that provided the insight, if you will, or maybe the catalyst for this work, is we asked those same leaders to rank their priorities,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
interesting.
building and maintaining culture came in at number 12.
Wow.
Now,
So there's a
I don't know
serious
about
mismatch.
you. I don't know
Yeah.
about you. I'm not working on my 12th priority, right?
Right, right.
On a good day, I work on a few of the top five.
Yeah,
And some days I don't
absolutely.
even feel like I get to those.
Right.
And so, what leaders are telling us is this is critically important to performance, which is something I actually care about and am paid to do.
Yeah,
And yet,
absolutely.
it's not even in my top 10 when I think about my priorities. And
Yeah.
so we went to work saying, how do we help leaders close this knowing doing gap? And that
Mhm.
actually became the charge for our team.
Well, and I love that, because one of the things I noticed in the book, is that at the end of each chapter, you give some real practical application steps, and I think that that's in my my understanding of culture. That's really where the rubber hits the road, and where a lot of leaders they just don't know what to do. And so you've provided that in the book, which I think is
Yeah.
really amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And it's not let me say this. Yes, I agree with everything you just said, but it's not just in culture. Uh, y- Regardless of the domain,
Mm-hmm.
you behave your way to high performance. You don't
Yeah.
believe your way there. You
Yep.
behave your way there. And so at the end of the day, you got to do something, and
Yeah.
hopefully, preferably, you do the right things, but
Right.
you have to act. And so we
Yeah.
decided to try and make this book as actionable as possible.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you a quick story. We were a bit overwhelmed when I mean, I just referenced some of the research, right? Talking to
Yeah.
over 6,000 folks. We did focus groups. We did hundreds of hours of desk research. We
Mm.
had there were 8 folks, as 8, 9, 10 folks on the research team. I had 3 Stanford professors helping me try and figure all this out. We had
Wow.
gobs of research, spent millions of dollars, several years. And we were, as a team, we were somewhat overwhelmed by it
Mm.
all.
Wow.
And we said, okay, all right, this is good. We think there's simplicity on the other side of complexity, but we've got to work through it.
Yeah.
And we were inspired by a story from the Navy SEALs. And I
Mm.
have to confess, we've spent a lot of time with SEALs over the years because they're pretty good at what they do. And
Yeah.
we've extracted a lot of lessons over time. And so in the context of this problem, we ran across an article written by a SEAL that said just a few years ago, they realized that they needed to hit the pause button because they'd been moving at the speed of war,
Ah.
which is an interesting way to think about it. It's probably the same
Mm-hmm.
speed that your listeners have been moving at, but the
Right.
difference is people are shooting at them. So they've been
Right.
moving at the speed of war. And they said,
Yeah.
but we had to pause because we wanted to document what is important for the next generation of SEALs. Now,
Ah,
as an
interesting.
aside, I think this was a pretty good leadership moment when they realized
Yeah,
that.
for sure.
Um, and so the first thing they wrote down was shoot, move, and communicate.
Mm.
Shoot, move, and communicate. Now, that's not how you build a great culture. I have to say
Right.
that because
Right.
I did a talk recently for a group and they were really excited. They thought that's how you build a great culture. And I said, put your guns away. No,
Right.
that's not it. But our team was inspired by that because I
Yeah.
know Rourke Denver, the former commander of the SEALs, and he would tell you there's a lot more you need to know to be a successful SEAL
Mm.
beyond shoot, move, and communicate.
Mm-hmm.
He, but he would probably say that's what you need to survive to fight another day,
Yeah,
right?
sure,
That's the
sure.
first thing they wrote down. And so our team said, why is that statement so powerful? Are those
Mm.
words?
Yeah.
They're clear, they're succinct, they're actionable, they provide direction. Oh, and they work. They add
Right.
real value. And
Mm.
so we then tweaked our assignment yet again and said, not only are we going to help leaders close this knowing doing gap,
Yeah.
we want to provide the equivalent of shoot, move, and communicate for
Yeah.
leaders when they think about culture. And that's how
Mhm.
we came up with the 3 culture rules.
I love that. Yeah, that's amazing. You know, one thing that just a question that just popped into my head as you were talking about the SEALs, because from a leadership perspective, I think, and you mentioned it, but I may say it a different way, but they were really planning for succession. They were looking at culture as a succession planning tool. So I'm kind of curious, how can leaders use culture in their organization, especially from somebody that's maybe there's an entrepreneur out there that's built a family business or some kind of a small thriving business, and they want to allow it to be in existence, basically form their legacy. And
Sure.
how do you have that transpire?
Well, I think it probably hinges on the strength and vitality of your culture. If
Yeah.
if it's strong, it has a much greater likelihood of standing the test of time and crossing generations.
Hmm.
I'm privileged to have worked at Chick-fil-A for decades and have seen the founder, Truett Cathy, who hired me as the
Yeah,
16th corporate employee. I was just
that's
a
amazing.
kid, went to work in the warehouse in the mailroom,
Yeah.
worked with Truett. Then I worked with his son, Dan, and now Dan has passed that senior leadership role to his son, Andrew.
Okay.
And we're working to make the culture stronger,
Mm,
to enhance the culture, to continually adapt.
mm,
But the essence of the culture is unchanged. And I
yeah.
think that's a testimony to the strength of culture that Truett built.
Hmm. Well, and that even brings up another, I guess, thought for me in that, generational differences are probably going to be very prevalent in any
Mm-hmm.
culture. So how do you bridge that gap, especially when you have, a multi-generational business? You have Truett, you've got Dan, and now Andrew. So how do you create a culture that spans those generational differences?
Well, yeah, that's a huge question.
Yeah. It's
I
probably
think
for another
first,
book, right?
no, but I would say first, the great cultures that I'm aware of are principle based.
Yeah.
And principles tend to have more staying power
Yeah.
than the latest trend or fad or new shiny object. And
Right.
so a culture that's principle based, again, I think has a better shot at working across generations. I
Yeah.
also think you've got to be willing and able to refresh a culture.
Yeah.
We changed our corporate core values a few years ago. Now,
Okay.
we didn't change our purpose. We achieved our mission, so we set a new mission. So I think there's a living, breathing dynamic that you have to
Mm.
honor.
Yeah, sure,
And I
sure.
mentioned earlier the constant efforts to enhance the culture. That's the third culture rule: is to adapt. If you've
Yeah.
got to always be working to enhance your culture, it's when you try to shrink wrap it to
Mhm.
protect it,
Yeah,
you kill it, you
yeah,
suffocate it, right? It's a living,
yeah,
breathing thing. And
yeah.
so I think you transcend generations um, and generational cohorts to your
Mhm.
point by being principle based, but also being able and willing to adapt over time.
Yeah, yeah, that's really
And that doesn't
interesting, and
make
I
it easy. I don't want that answer to
no,
make it sound easy. It's a lot of
sure,
work.
right.
And then related, last thought I'll say,
Yeah,
related to that, it's a little off your question, but I've had this question many, many times. It's like, well, how do you lead Gen X or Gen Z or Gen Y or Gen
yeah,
Q, whatever. And I said, well, here's the deal. I'm encouraging leaders. I mean, I've tried to do this myself. I've encouraged leaders my entire career to be really careful that you're not painting with too broad a brush.
oh,
Because I
sure.
would guarantee you know men and women in a single generational cohort who are fundamentally different.
Yeah, yeah,
And so my encouragement is to treat people like individuals,
mm,
not like
that's good.
members of a generational cohort, and
Gosh, that's so good.
meet people where they are. And that's been my go-to play as you think about working with a 20-year-old or a 70-year-old. It's like
Right.
don't label them generationally, but
Mhm.
approach them as an individual.
Yeah, that's so good. That is so good, Mark. Well, kind of going back to culture, like the definition for a moment, how do you define a high performance culture? Because I mean, you're talking about Navy SEALs; they're obviously high performers, and
Mm-hmm.
so how do you define a high performance culture?
Okay. Well, I'm gonna give you one word of context. We decided because one of the things we're looking for is there a universally accepted definition of culture? Forget high
Yeah,
performance for a minute. And
sure,
we couldn't find any consensus among the thought leaders.
sure.
And so, in an attempt to make all of this actionable, make it
Hmm.
approachable, we said we're going to define culture as the cumulative effect of
Mm,
what people see, hear, experience, and believe. The
okay.
cumulative effect of what people see, hear, experience, and believe. Now, we love that for a lot of reasons. One is who has the greatest influence in an organization on what people see, hear, experience, and believe? It's the leader.
The
It's
leader.
the
Yeah.
leader. And
Hmm.
so that's our working definition of culture. A high performance culture, you got to have three elements to meet that standard as far as we're concerned. One is alignment. You've got to
Okay.
have the majority of people who are pursuing the same aspiration. And the
Mm,
more you have, the stronger the culture. So if you talk about a strong or weak culture, I would say it's how many people have bought into and are actively pursuing the aspiration. That's step one.
hmm
The second criteria is you've got to have high performance.
hmm
Because if you're a good performing organization, congratulations. The world is full of good organizations.
Yeah.
I would argue that those organizations at best have a good culture. A
Mm.
high performance culture is one in which performance, high levels of performance, is sustained over time.
Yeah.
And then the third criteria is you have to be always working to improve the culture. Because if you're a high performance culture by those first two standards and you're not working to enhance it, you'll not be able to sustain that level of performance.
Yeah.
So those are
So
the three criteria.
it's really looking for continual improvement and
Yes.
continually. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't want a moment of greatness or a flash of brilliance. You
Right.
want to be a perennial high performer.
Right. Right.
You want to be one of those elite organizations that wins year after year after year after year after year. So that's
Yeah.
impossible without that enhancement component.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you worked for Chick-fil-A for so many years. So what did you what at Chick-fil-A, what did you as an organization do to really be a high performance? I mean, did you see the organization being very intentional with those three aspects? And if so, like did that come from, Truett and Dan, and how did that come to be?
Yeah. So let me say two things about that. We did this work so that we could strengthen our culture.
Okay.
So we didn't, this book is not about Chick-fil-A. We went
Right.
out in the world and obviously, or I should not obviously, thankfully, we found it very affirming that we
Okay,
do a
sure.
lot of these things. But I think there had been an element of unconscious competence
Right.
that,
I
and
was
you
thinking the
met
same
leaders
thing.
like this, and there's an
Yes.
intuition that drives their behavior and they get stuff right. And we're thankful for all of the intuitive leaders that have served our organization for generations.
Yeah.
But we wanted to help the entire organization get better. So we've got over 3,000 restaurants, and each of them has their own culture. And so we
Yeah.
spent 3.5 days in February of this year teaching the content that you and I are going over here. We had
Wow.
over 9,000 people in the room for 3.5 days because
Wow.
we want to get better. So we've done a lot of these things and there has been a level of intentionality, but
Mm.
now we've got a shared and common language. And I
Oh,
think the
yes.
culture is going to get stronger, not only collectively, but in those individual restaurants.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, and taking that many people out of the business for 3 days, I think you already answered this question, but there's a lot of leaders who think that, if I'm going to work on culture, or if I'm going to work on any initiative and I'm going to put money into it, I need to see that return. So obviously there's a big cost, but how do you, I guess this is maybe the age old question. How do you measure culture, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. So two thoughts on that. Truett decided 53 years ago
Wow.
that we would bring everybody together. And in
Okay.
that first meeting, there were 7 staff members, 7 restaurant operators, and they had a dinner and invited spouses and had 7 show up. So there were
Wow.
21 in that first event 53
Wow.
years ago. This February, in about 60 days, they'll cross 10,000 folks. And
Wow.
so for
Wow.
over 50 years, we felt like there was a return, a
Mhm.
significant return. Now, to your point about how you measure culture, I love that question because I hear it all the time. And there are people who think you can't. And here's what I would say to them. If you think you can't measure it, you haven't defined it clearly.
Mm.
Because
Yeah, I
once you
see.
define it, you can measure it. I'll give you an example, which I wrote about in the book. When Satya Nadella took over at Microsoft for Steve Ballmer, he wanted to change the culture. He had a new aspiration. He wanted them to move from being know-it-alls to learn-it-alls.
Interesting.
That was the aspiration, the cultural aspiration. And so they set the metric of growth mindset, Carol Dweck's work. And they said, we're going to measure growth mindset, and that's going to be our primary cultural metric, because that'll let us know where people are on that journey. And I use that example because if you're not trying to create a learning organization, growth mindset is probably not a great culture metric.
Right.
But if that's what you're trying to create, it's a perfect culture metric. And so go back and figure out, what is it you're trying to accomplish? What is the aspiration? Again, that's rule number one, is aspire. Share your hopes and dreams for your culture. Once you've got that, there are a lot of smart people around you that can figure out how to measure it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that so measuring your culture and actually amplifying it is you have to also, as a leader, be willing to listen to your people. And you talk about this in the book. I think you call it intentional listening. So talk a little bit about that, because I think that as leaders, we think that we're supposed to, just tell everything about our culture and tell all the time. But there really is an aspect of culture that's really about listening.
Yeah. Well, we talk about that under the third rule, which is adapt, because I would argue that to adapt well, you must listen well. Sometimes you'll know where you need to work, and that's great, and go to work. But sometimes you won't know where you need to go to work. We've done a couple of global surveys of leaders in the last 5 years, and in both cases, we found about a 40-point spread between what leaders think and what the front line thinks on various topics.
Sure.
So I'm thinking somebody's out of touch.
Right.
And maybe truth is in the middle, but I don't assume that the masses are wrong when they say this is not a great place to work. To them, it's not a great place to work.
Right.
So we think listening well is always a precursor to adapting well, because that helps you know what you need to work on to strengthen your culture.
Right. And I know we've been talking about senior leaders a lot, but what if you're not a senior leader? What if you're someone, maybe you're a middle manager, maybe you're a frontline contributor? How do you affect culture where you're at? And I guess, let's just go with that.
Okay. Well, we've talked about the first rule, which is to aspire, to share your hopes and dreams for your culture. You would assume that a senior leader has done that. If they haven't, I would encourage that mid-level leader to share their hopes and dreams for the micro culture that they're trying to create. But the way you activate that is the second rule, which is to amplify. You've got to always be looking for ways to reinforce the aspiration. And you can do that at any level, because ultimately what you're trying to do is to enroll everyone to work together to make the aspiration a reality. And leaders may drive that process, but leaders alone can't create a culture. The only way you create a culture is when the people at the front lines actually say, we're gonna work to make this true. Right? That's why it's aspirational, because it's a future vision for the organization. And so this process of amplification is what leaders at all levels need to be engaged in. And I'm keeping our eye on the clock here, but let me give you just a couple of quick examples. One, and I think it's perhaps the most powerful, is role modeling. It's role modeling. People always watch the leader, whether we want them to or not. And so if you're talking about something as being important, people are watching us as leaders to see if our actions align with our words. Now, if they don't, we do a lot of harm to our credibility, people's confidence, their willingness to follow. But we also do harm to the aspiration, because people are not going to pursue something they don't think their leader believes in. or
Right.
something their leader is willing to pursue. And
Mhm.
so people always watch the leader. And so I'm telling folks, whatever that aspiration is, you need to act like it's true
Mm.
or that you are, in fact, pursuing it as well. And at some point, if you amplify well, there are any number of strategies and tactics, people will begin to say, huh, I think they're serious.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think we're really going to do this. I think I
Mm.
better get on board. And that's how you begin to enroll others to join you. It's in this process of amplification. You're going to get very few of them when you just share the aspiration, the
Mhm.
vision, or the values, or the mission. I mean, you'll have a few that'll say, "Yeah, I'd like to be part of that." Everybody, the vast majority of people are in the wait and see category. And
Sure.
one of the things they're waiting to see is how you, as the leader, live
Yeah.
out this aspiration. So
The
that's one.
aspiration.
Another is storytelling.
Mm.
Are you making heroes of the people who are helping you pursue the aspiration?
I love that.
Um, yeah, it's and when you do, you'll get more of those behaviors. I
Right.
was a few years ago, we were studying execution, and we found ourselves with the football coaches over at Clemson University. Now, I know they've had a couple of hard seasons, but you look at the last decade, they're pretty good at execution. And so we went
Yep.
over there to study execution. And one of the things we learned, one of their key strategies to create a culture of execution was storytelling. And they
Mm.
said every time
Interesting.
they meet, they tell a story of somebody who's helping them pursue their aspiration. And I
Mhm.
said, well, that sounds hard. And he said, well, which part? And I said, well, you guys meet a lot. And they said, we meet a lot more than you think we meet. And I said, do you have enough stories? He said, we got 152 players who are every day, plus our coaching staff, every day, they're trying to help us uh, achieve our aspiration. So
Yeah.
we got plenty of stories. The
Mm.
trick is, which ones do you tell? And they
Yeah.
said, and the more we tell those stories, the more people demonstrate those behaviors.
Mm.
Isn't
Yeah.
it? It's crazy
That's
that,
interesting.
that
Yeah.
it's human nature.
Yeah.
Um, I think it was Plato that said, "What is honored in a country is cultivated there." You
Mm.
start honoring people through storytelling, and more
Yeah.
people want to be honored in that same fashion.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's
I think
crazy.
even I think in this I think in the book you also talk about at Clemson. I think it's at Clemson where there's a rock where everybody touches it as they're coming into the stadium, but then I think the coach, if I'm remembering my story right, the coach said basically, touch it if you're willing to give everything, but if you're not, keep your filthy hands off of it, or something like along
Yeah.
those lines.
Yeah, exactly. And that was under the section on symbols and traditions is
Okay.
they
Yeah.
yeah, if you're not going to give 110%, don't touch this rock.
Right. Right.
And so they're making that commitment as they take the field. And they've
Yeah.
got a really high winning percentage at that particular stadium.
At their stadium. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not. It
Yeah.
probably does. Let me share
Yeah.
one more idea for people because it
Love
is
it.
so
Yes.
pragmatic. Some people overlook the power. I call it strategic repetition.
Glad you
Strategic
said that. Yes.
repetition.
Yes.
We were interviewing a senior leader from Netflix, and I asked him how often he talked about the culture because some of
Mm.
your listeners may know Netflix has a reputation for a pretty good culture.
Yeah.
He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and I wondered if I had offended him. I wasn't sure what I had said that created this look on his face.
Sure.
And he said, "Well, every day." He said, "Every leader at Netflix talks about the culture every day." He
Every
said, "Why
day.
wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It's most important." Now, I want to put an asterisk on most important. Um, Culture's never the goal. Culture is an enabler.
Oh, yeah.
Performance is the goal, but leaders around the world know the most powerful driver of performance is culture. This
That's right.
Netflix guy knew that, and supposedly all of their leaders understand. He said it's most
Mm.
important. He said, "Why wouldn't you talk about it every day?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, just to raise the bar a little further, because I'm looking myself in the mirror after that meeting, going, how strategic, how thoughtful, how intentional am I talking
Mhm.
about our culture? Then I encountered another leader who's a CEO of an organization serving more than 100 countries. So I've never been a CEO, but any CEO leading is a big job. And then you think leading in 100 countries, it's a big job.
It's even a bigger job. Yeah.
And he thought this idea of talking about culture once a day was kind of lame. And I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I talk about it in every meeting. And I can only
Oh, wow.
imagine how many meetings this guy's in. And I
Yeah.
said, how does that work? He said, well, I'm always listening. Is the person leading the meeting connecting what we're doing back to our aspiration?
Mm.
He said, if we get to the end of the meeting and they've not connected the dots, I connect the dots. And I'm processing that. And he said, oh, and by the way, if we get to the end of the meeting and what we just talked about is not going to help us move toward our aspiration, I asked the entire assembled group, why were we talking about this?
Mm. Yeah, that's so good.
So
Because
strategic repetition is another way that leaders at all levels can be champions of the culture. And you need a lot of culture champions to get this out ultimately to the masses.
For sure. Well, and I think too, about any human behavior change, if we're gonna, instill human behavior as our culture, we have to, if you think about it, you have to repeat over and over and over again. I had a bunch of kids. And so I remember, having to tell them over and over and over again, go brush your teeth, go.
Yeah.
And so I think that strategic repetition is so powerful when it comes to culture.
So here's the deal. The bottom line, it's kind of a subtext for everything we've talked about, is leaders animate culture.
Yeah.
Or not. Right?
Yeah.
Culture by design or culture by default. You're going to have a culture. Every organization has one. Is it what you want as a leader? And is it helping you pursue sustained levels of elite performance? If not, what are you going to do about it? Right? How can you change your culture to move toward that aspiration? And it's within our power as leaders to do this, but just many are not working on it.
Well, and I think one of the other things that you talk about in the book towards the end of the book is really the power of exiting someone who is not a good cultural fit or who is, a toxin for the culture. And I think that there are a lot of leaders who that's just really hard for them to even think about. But I think if we're going to have a high performance culture, we have to look at that aspect of exiting people who aren't living up to the culture that we're aspiring to.
I think you're absolutely correct. This whole idea of toxins, when you think about the third rule, to adapt, you're always working to enhance the culture. The first priority is to identify and eradicate toxins. A toxin is any pattern of unhealthy or unproductive behavior. And so sometimes those patterns emerge in a person. And you, again, I would always say to err on the side of grace when you're dealing with people, but at some point you don't want a person to sink the ship. Or to sink the team. And I've actually had to remove people from teams before because their behavior was toxic. And you get to decide as a leader, are you willing to sacrifice the team or more because somebody doesn't want to pursue the aspiration that leadership is set for the organization. And so, yes, sometimes a person has got to go, but there are other toxins. Complacency, lack of or loss of procedural discipline, mistrust, whiplash, where leaders keep changing priorities. That's a toxin. People don't know what to do, and they just become paralyzed. So I think you've got to be on guard for any of these patterns. Sometimes, as you said, they'll become manifest in an individual, and then you've got to make some hard decisions.
Yeah, right. Well, Mark, I think that your work here in culture is so powerful, and I've read a lot of culture books, and you're just the best. It really is amazing.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. I appreciated how practical it was. You brought in the research, yes, but then you brought in the practicality for leaders to be able to actually do something with their culture and really create that high performance culture. So I'm curious if there's anything that we've left out here. What have we missed that you would love to be able just to share with our leaders and our listeners listening today?
I would encourage leaders not to think about culture as something extra or extracurricular.
Hmm.
Like as you go, um, there's a story. I don't remember if it actually made it in the book or not. I was interviewing a CEO of a 100-plus-year-old organization, a lot of employees, great organization, and he was proudly sharing with me the fact that they had just refreshed their vision and values, and he was trying to maintain the relevance and vitality of this century old organization. And I will
Hmm.
just tell you, the work they had done was fantastic.
Hmm.
When he shared it with me, I wanted to go to work for the guy. I mean, it's like, this is the kind of who wouldn't want to work at this kind of organization? So they had done a
Yeah.
lot of really good work. It had been an arduous journey. He
Hmm.
shared all of that. And so I was happy for him. And as we got to the end of our time, he said, I'm going to need to leave just a couple minutes early. And I said, well, you've been very generous with your time. You leave when you need to leave. And he went on to volunteer that he was going to speak to a group of new employees and that he made it his practice to be part of the orientation for all new staff. And I'm thinking, fantastic. How many CEOs are doing that, right? I think
Right.
it's a really good way to help indoctrinate people. And
Hmm.
I casually said, well, I'm assuming you'll share with them what you just shared with me. And he said, the thought never crossed my mind.
Really?
I wanted to whack him upside the head.
No kidding. I'm surprised. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Leaders, it's going to require some intentionality, but I
Mm.
don't know that it requires a lot different. When you talk
Yeah.
to new employees, when you talk to existing employees, when you do performance reviews, when you talk to vendors, when you talk to customers,
Yeah.
you ought to be talking about who you're trying to become as
Hmm.
an organization. And,
Mm.
and so I just would encourage leaders as they go,
Mm.
don't forget you are the primary champion of the culture. You can't do it alone, but you can't delegate it either. People
Mm.
always watch the leader.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's so true. So true. Mark, thank you so much for this great wisdom. Thank you for just sharing your depth of knowledge and breadth on not only just culture but leadership, because I think they really truly are, as you just eloquently stated, they are really one and the same. And so I really,
Yeah.
really appreciate that. So thanks
Well,
for
it's
being
been
here
great to
today.
be with you. Let me offer two things.
Yes.
If folks want to get in touch with me, my cell number is 678 612 8441. Be happy to engage in a conversation. And we do
Awesome.
have a website. It's leadeveryday.com.
Awesome.
And if I can serve any of you, please let me know.
Thank you so much. We will make sure that the number and also the website are in the show notes. If you didn't catch
Great.
that, yeah, we'll make sure it's there. So, Mark, thank you again. Appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure.